think this is one of the most important debates of our conference because it precedes the technologies and the tools we are discussing throughout different panels and establish the priorities for each institution for their modernization on how they are mapping users, that parliamentarians, civil servants, legislative councils, secretary generals, different people that deeply know the business of parliaments and how we can help them to perform their duties better. So the goal of our debate today is trying to think on methodologies, strategies, and even past experiences on how to do that, how to map appropriately how parliaments are seeking their modernization strategy in this post-pandemic era. So before we begin our debate, I will yield the floor to each one of you very briefly to introduce yourself, a little bit on your organization, and how you are related to the topic of legislative modernization. So I'm doing this alphabetically. So Ben, would you like to start introducing yourself?
Well, thank you very much, Luís. And thanks again for this opportunity. My name is Benjamin Opoku. I work with the Parliamentary Network Africa as a senior program officer. And here at Parliamentary Network Africa, or PN Africa, our goal is to see that parliaments are adopting measures and reforms that seeks to enhance the participation of the public, participation of people, of citizens, and to ensure that the interests of these citizens are represented in the work of Parliament, or are represented in the policies and the laws that Parliament needs. And so for us, anything that helps us to work closely with parliaments, and for instance, that is why we convene the networks of CSOs that work with parliaments across Africa. And our goal again is to ensure that we equip these CSOs to be able to effectively engage with their parliaments. And again, in the engagement with these parliaments, it means that they are well pleased to bring on the experiences that will help parliaments to modernize, to leverage on the technology that they are able to use to improve their work. And so once again, I must thank you for this, and I look forward to our discussions.
Thank you so much, Ben, for participating with us today. Mark, would you like to introduce yourself to the colleagues?
Sure. Thank you, Luís. Good to see all of you, and thanks again to Bússola Tech for putting these discussions together. They're always so productive and so useful, I think, for so many of us around the world. I'm Mark Stodder. I'm president of Xcential Legislative Technologies. Our company is focused on modernizing one of the core parts of the legislative process, which is bill drafting and amending, publication, codification, that area. We work with governments around the world, including the US Congress. We've been helping the US House and Government Publishing Office move a lot of processes forward around the legislative document, moving into more digital forms, more standardized data forms, which is a core thing that we work on, which is to have a part of modernization governments include standardizing how legislation is represented as data, and to move it toward forms like a Comentoso and others that can create a kind of a non-proprietary open source way of being able to access the law. And so we've been working for about 20 years, beginning in California, which is where we're based in the US. And we've had a lot of experience with the governments that I hope I can share with you today.
Thank you so much, Mark. Vernon, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Luís. Good evening, everybody, Mark and Ben and the rest of the online colleagues. Vernon Titus is my name. I work at the Western Cape Provincial Parliament in South Africa. I'm the Director Institutional Enablement. It's a fancy name for being slogging at everything else that everybody is not wanting to do. So essentially, it looks at driving the digital transformation strategy of the organization through people management, through technology, in information technology and digital services, through knowledge management, information services, as well as providing direct support to members of parliament. So it's quite a wide platform. I think the journey and my presentation yesterday essentially looked to what extent we have been experiencing this digitalization journey, what digital means to us, how we've mapped and planned through that. It is our unique experience. And I think a number of the goals that we had set for this particular journey has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 experience and the rapid changes that have been happening within our organization. So obviously, we are concerned with public participation, as Ben had indicated. We're obviously concerned with lawmaking because that is our core mandate, and we are concerned with oversight over the executive, which is in public interest. So that, in broad strokes, is where I'm from, and I'm looking forward to the lively discussions here today.
Thank you so much, Vernon, for your introduction. Allow me to explain a little bit on the format of our debate today. I'm going to pose the first question to all of you to answer. And after this first question, I will bring a question to each one of you. And after this first person answers, I will invite all the other colleagues here in this panel to comment on this first person response. So the idea is to have a conversation between you guys, not a presentation, not something as formal as we had with other moments of the conference. So I will ask Vernon to answer the first question. And Vernon, Bússola Tech recently hosted a debate about the main demands and challenges in providing civil servants in Parliament and MPs with digital-friendly solutions that not only do not impair their legislative activities, also enable them to exercise their functions even better. Another recent discussion about the modularization of legislative systems, we noticed that demands from different business areas may vary considerably. Based on your experience, what are the methodologies to properly map high-level demands from different legislative areas, and how to prioritize them in the digital transformation strategy in the Parliament? If you can answer this, Vernon, in 4 minutes, please.
Okay, it's not an easy question, Louis. I do think that organizations such as parliaments are very, very different. Priorities are also extremely different. And I think what one has to look at is really an inward-looking focus around what kind of resourcing you have, what kind of strengths you have as an organization, but also identifying key elements of impact that you would want to achieve overall over a period of time. I think what becomes extremely important is that an organization such as a parliament identifies what the lasting legacy is that they want to achieve in a process such as a digitalization journey. I think the what and the how are extremely important in identifying what is feasible and what is possible within an organization. So while legislatures and parliaments have very different expertise, very different skill sets, very different growth paths, I think what does become extremely important is that you identify key enablers, 1 or 2 major key enablers or game changers that you can say, right, this is what we will rally around. These are the 2 aspects that we will use to assist us in setting us up for success. The Big Bang Theory does not necessarily work. What in my experience, I think, if you have strategic impetus, buy-in from members of parliament, buy-in from the leadership of the organization, and buy-in from your staff, because at the key of it all sits people, your processes, and technology that you want to infuse. These 3 aspects form an integral part. It is a 3-legged stool, and if one aspect of that those legs are not working operatively, I think the entire project and process will collapse. So the idea is that we identify what our strategic goals are that we want to achieve through modernization and through digitalization. I think it's important to know that content and the work of Parliament cannot be diluted as a result of technology, but the technology is supposed to enhance what it is that we're supposed to be bringing. And so using the technology to infuse our content experience and our content knowledge becomes key. So in short, I don't know how much time I have, Luís, you must interject if I'm carrying on too long, but in short for me, identify one or two major game changers to identify what it is that you would want to achieve. So that's the first thing. Secondly, have consideration for the integration of people, processes, and technology in all of your facets, so that all aspects throughout the process are strengthened. And thirdly, get buy-in from members of Parliament, broader stakeholders, and people within the organization. That is what I would say. And it is different for each particular Parliament, but I think those aspects are central to all organizations.
Thank you so much, Vernon, for your response. It's interesting to notice and to share with colleagues that, if I'm not mistaken, it was in December, the Western Cape Provincial Parliament in South Africa promoted a workshop to discuss with colleagues from other countries to learn from their experience about their digital transformation process. And it brings a concept that I really like from a colleague from the Knesset in Israel, Robin Treisman, that when she says that parliaments need to shop for ideas to see what other colleagues are doing, how they are tackling their challenges. Ben, would you like to answer the same question?
Yes, thank you, Luís. I think, yes, can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes, we can hear you perfectly.
Yeah, so Vernon touched on very critical issues, and I'll just also like to, extend on some of them, especially the first, which is stakeholder analysis, right? So before we introduce new solutions to Parliament, we need to have a good understanding of the stakeholders who are involved in the processes of the Parliament, who are involved in the solutions, the technology solutions that may have impact on the lawmaking and the policy making in the Parliament. So for instance, engaging the staff of Parliament, engaging the MPs, even political parties who are represented. Because, at some point in the work of Parliament, even political parties may have influence as to which technology, because they are dealing with power. So if introducing a new solution, introducing a new technology, it's something that may affect their hold on power. Political parties can fight against its introduction. So it's good to even understand interest groups, civil society, who are also interested because they work closely with parliaments. And so also understanding how they wish to contribute to the process, or how they feel they will also be allowed to contribute to the process of lawmaking and policy making is very important. Again, we need to also understand the priorities of Parliament, right? So each Parliament may have different priorities. What are their priorities when it comes to introducing new technology? Do they have an understanding of the impact they are looking at making with the introduction of these technologies? And then again, what is the urgency of these technologies that they want to introduce? Having a good understanding of all of these helps to align with even the Parliament's strategic plans when it comes to digitalizing, or when it comes to modernizing the parliamentary process and all of that. Again, also, we need to understand that there are different levels of maturity for every parliament, right? Some parliaments may be very mature when it comes to adapting and using technology. Some parliaments, or even some countries, may be far behind the use of technology or even internet penetration. And so all of these things we need to understand and ensure that parliaments we want to introduce these solutions to are ready to adapt them. When they are ready to adapt them, then they open up to understanding these processes and even making inputs making inputs to ensure that they accept because they are part of the processes and all of that. So it makes it easier. And then finally, I would say that it's also good that we benchmark against the workables, those solutions that are working, we feel are working across, for instance, if it's on the continent of Africa, what other parliaments in Africa or have adopted some solutions or some technologies that are working for them. Can we also introduce the same technology in our context? So I think understanding these variables and these contexts would help us to better understand Parliament in prioritizing their technology needs.
Thank you so much, Ben. It caught my attention when you say about access to internet connectivity, even constant electricity supply, because I remember 3 years ago when we were at the very beginning of the pandemic, a subnational legislature here in Brazil, in the Amazon region, they wanted help to implement the remote deliberation system. And it was a very simple system using Zoom, no e-voting solution. But when we asked them about the internet connectivity in the city, we noticed that the region where most parliamentarians live, there was no internet connectivity whatsoever, not even cable, not even cell phone connectivity. So there was a problem, there was a structural problem that preceded any strategy they could implement. So they were not able to host any remote meeting during the pandemic because of that. So I think it's very interesting about what you say, because you have to consider, of course, internal factors, but also external factors and how parliaments are inserted in this larger scope and larger reality. Mark, would you like to share your thoughts on my first question of today's debate?
Sure. Yeah, I think the discussion has been great so far, and I agree with so much of what has been said. In a perfect world, when you're mapping it out, and we've seen some legislatures do this, or parliaments do this, where there is a strategic plan, where priorities are determined, the technology that is breaking is put at the top of the list, and there's a good plan that is laid out and begins to be followed through on. And then things happen. We remember that parliaments and legislatures are political bodies, and it is, as Ben said, it is about power often, and about which technology change will aid those in power the most, and so it can be a very messy business. And so we've seen technology projects kind of go this way and that way, and I know of legislative technology directors who have their plan for the year, and it's all set, they're working it, and then the leader of one of the bodies says, I want this new thing on my phone, and everything changes. So that can happen. But I think, in general, what I've seen work is if, I think as Vernon said, if key game changers can be identified, where if there's a certain change that can happen in the technology of a parliament that can give a pretty quick benefit, then that can start to cause momentum to get going for other changes. We've seen it in one legislature we work with, where they have very old technology for how they do bill drafting. It's 20 years old, needs to be changed, but that's a really big project, really hard to do. So they've started chipping away around the edges of it, and we've helped implement one of the technologies that I think has been that kind of game-changing technology, one that impacts the public, impacts public transparency of the law, and that's to put an application in that shows comparisons of bills as they move through the process. So people, members, staff can start to see, how did that piece of legislation change with amendments? And so it lifts the veil on a lot of the process that happens in government, and it can also, it's starting to spin out some other changes technologically. But along with finding a game-changing thing to create, to modernize, it's also all about identifying the game changer, the person within the government who, within the clerk's office or somewhere, who is passionate about this, has his or her own thinking about where this could go, and doing what you can to support them as they drive forward. We found that technology changes that are lasting and most important really can't happen without that person or two or three of them who are really pushing things forward, because they tend to be the professionals in the office who aren't part of the political process, are thinking more about the institution, thinking about what can sustain the institution, what can improve the institution, and not about today's political win or loss and so forth. So I think those are some of the key elements when you're starting to map out how to bring digitization and modernization and positive change to parliaments.
Thank you so much, Mark. You just reminded me the debate we had at the end of last year with Mr. Anders Johnson, the former Secretary General of the IPU,
Right,
and the former Secretary General in the House of Representatives, Leonardo Barbosa. He brought a question that touched on what you just said about the dichotomy between the democracy side of Parliament and the governance side of Parliament. So how can you plan ahead, let's say, for a transformation process, let's say, to transform your bill drafting process for the next 5 years, let's say for 10 years in the future, if the IT director or the Secretary General is changing every 2 years? So
right.
how can you have continuity on the planning, even not only on the tools, but on establishing the priorities? Saying, okay, we have a limited amount of resources, so we are investing in this because this is a top priority for this administration. So I think it's a very interesting case. And you touched on another point that I think is absolutely important, that is, we are dealing with political institutions, traditional institutions that represent multiple views about our society and our government and how they should operate. And it's interesting because the smallest processes in the institutions, they are affected by these different views. So you need to reach out to the owner, if we can say, of the process, to understand how it was designed, and even any particular issues on that process that you might see as inefficient. It's interesting to reach out to the particular person to say, okay, why did you design it? Is there a specific reason for that to exist? And not just to top it down and say, okay, we are avoiding this altogether and create a crisis inside the institution. So yeah. I think it was a very interesting point that you bring to us in your opening answer. So allow me to ask my second question to you, Vernon, and ask the colleagues to comment on your answer. One of the most interesting insights colleagues usually report to us after our discussions are about the similarities of the challenges each legislature faces in their modernization journey, ranging from IT-based processes to procedural, cultural aspects of the institution, and so forth. Recently, myself and our dear colleague from the Brazilian House of Representatives participated in a workshop that was organized by the Western Cape Provincial Assembly in South Africa to promote the exchange from different colleagues about the digital transformation in the legislative. Although these institutions may hold similarities, there are still significant differences that must be considered when choosing to cooperate to another parliament experience, for example. What are your considerations when internalizing an external experience in mapping a priority for the modernization of the institution and designing this solution? Meaning, how can you learn from another colleague's experience and bring this experience inside, in a sense, it is adapted to your own reality? I think you're on mute.
Okay, is that better?
Perfect.
Okay, that's quite a tough one, Louis. I think Ben started responding to some of that a little earlier. While there are clearly learnings that we can gauge from one another in the various spheres of government and in the across the various parliaments, whether it be on the African continent or whether it be elsewhere in the Commonwealth or in other parliaments across the world. So there are commonalities around the purposes or the overall purpose of Parliament, within the confines and the context of a democracy. And I think though that is the line that sort of amalgamates or joins the purpose of a parliament in the first place. In that particular regard, most parliaments are concerned with its core business as engaging with the public, ensuring that our core business of lawmaking and oversight, that those are being attended to. What I do think we are able to learn from each other in the sense that while we might not necessarily have the kind of resources that Mark might have in his spaces, or what that Ben might have in their spaces, there are key markers to each of the journeys that we've traveled in identifying where it is that we are moving in a modernizing kind of world. I think it becomes important for us to be looking, and you've just raised the issue around infrastructure now earlier, Luis. The fact that is a clear marker for things that we are able to do and enhancement or advancement that we are able to implement. And I think these are basic considerations that each of us, when we are in our various parliaments or legislatures, must take into account. It's about what is the political landscape like within my particular context? What are the skill sets like within my particular context? What does my infrastructure look like within my particular context? What am I able to learn about strategies to build capacity, capability, whether that is from a culture perspective, whether that is from a capacity broad perspective, or whether that is from a competence perspective? What is it that I'm able to learn from other people who have traversed that road already? So it is really a very insular, inward-looking kind of perspective, while taking learnings from other areas. I think one of the other important things that maybe Ben has also alluded to a little earlier, that we've embarked on, is a maturity model, an organization-wide maturity model. Because while digitalization is digital transformation is a particular agenda, I think the organization's overall purpose in driving an organizational maturity model that can move into continuous improvement is important, because that provides you with a roadmap going forward. But that also gives you an indication of where my gaps are, what the challenges are, and it allows us to confront those challenges specifically within the various legislatures and parliaments that we work in.
Thank you so much, Vernon. Mark, would you like to comment on that?
Sure. So thinking about kind of how institutions can learn from each other and help them establish their priorities, obviously it can be very complex, or it can be as simple as, and this will, and may end up being a plug for Bússola Tech and what you do. It can be as simple as really convening those who are doing the work in the parliaments and getting them together. We participate in a number of groups like Bússola Tech, but in the US, there's a National Association of Legislative IT Professionals, where it's representatives from state legislatures around the US, 50 states, and they come together to share best practices, talk about what they're doing. They have the benefit of some fairly common systems, some relatively alike legislative bodies, so that makes it a lot easier. But they're able to do some things like, giving each other displays of the latest technology they've implemented, and also sharing those best practices, talking about, well, we created this voting application, or we've created this way to display text from laws, or with amendments engrossed, or things like that. And what I've observed is just an eagerness to learn, and not just to see kind of the glitz of a new application, but to really try to understand, how did you implement it? What were, coming to our first question, what were some of the things you had to do to traverse the landscape of politics and very strict traditions and processes, and how to get through all of that? Because so much of this is not about, as we spoke earlier, not so much about the technology, but about how to work with people and various processes to create change. So I think from what we've seen, the more often that legislative professionals from both the technology side and then the higher level thinking about digitization can get together and to share these best practices, the better. And often it really is a matter of showing the actual technology and then talking about how did you do it? How did we get from here to there? And what has the impact been on the institution and on the public?
Thank you so much, Mark, for your comments. Ben, would you like to close this round and share your comments on what the colleagues just shared?
Yeah, that's very interesting to hear from the earlier speakers. I mean, here in Africa, we have a very diverse culture cutting across all the 54 countries on the continent. Even to some extent, in countries, you would have diverse subcultures and all of that. And so one of the things that for me, I consider to be very important for us to look at when it comes to sharing experience or transferring experience and all of that is how these experiences fit into the culture of whichever parliament or whichever country that we want to introduce that solution, right? Because do the stakeholders accept or fall in line with the culture that is being transferred from the external environment or the other parliament to that parliament? Are the MPs comfortable with it? Are the other stakeholders also interested in participating or adapting to that experience or that culture? So for me, I think we need to evaluate the internal culture and then also the external culture that is being transferred, because how we use technology in our culture may be different from how a different parliament uses that technology. And so I think it's one thing that we need to really note. And then again, we also want to look at the relevance of the experience that is being transferred, right? Is it something, what has been, or what was the goal of the initiative in the other parliaments? What was the goal? What was the objective of the solution in the other parliaments? Do we share similar goals? Do we share similar objectives? Is it similar thing that we want to achieve in our context? So I think these are some of the things we also need to consider, so that even it matches the priorities of the parliament that is accepting the experience, the parliament that is accepting the solution, so that it becomes easier for them to use and all of that. And then finally, I would say we also need to consider the feasibility of implementation, right? So the receiving parliament or the parliament that is going to cooperate to use this solution or experience, do they have the resources? Do they have the resources to hold these solutions? Do they have the viable legal or regulatory environment that welcomes some of these solutions or that welcomes some of these initiatives and experiences? I think that some of these indicators may also determine whether such experience or such solutions can be transferable from one parliament to the other. And so for me, I think if you're able to consider all of these things, transferring and of course cooperating with parliaments will be much easier in our context here in Africa.
Thank you so much, Ben, for your comments. Before I can proceed to our next question, there is an interesting comment here in the chat by Isabel Nascimento. She is the IT director in the Republic Assembly of Mozambique. She says that she definitely agrees with Ben. And the Mozambique Republic Assembly, the infrastructure is their big challenge, according to her. And according to her also, after the strategic planning, the next step is human resources, the infrastructure. And without that, she says that they cannot even dream with IT modernization. And she says that this is her heart speaking. And your English is perfect, Isabel. Thank you so much for your comments. Absolutely, it's a pleasure to us to welcome our colleagues from Mozambique here in today's debate. So allow me to bring my second question to you, Mark. As we discussed before in our debate, and we mentioned here with all of you mentioned this somehow, parliaments are traditional institutions. centered in the consensus building decision-making process. And this particular characteristic might lead academics to understand legislative institutions as late adopters, as they would be averse to risk in changing the processes. A statement I disagree at some level, but making an appropriate diagnostic of the challenges in the institution, on what the institution seeks to tackle in their digital transformation strategy, will determine the success of the implementation stage and the evaluation of the results, reducing the risks for the institution. Very few organizations on the planet have the experience to have worked side by side with colleagues from different legislatures, battle testing solutions and methodologies along the way, such as a few private companies as represented in our panel today. Mark, what are your considerations about this topic?
Well, actually, I think the comment you shared from one of our viewers was perfect, because it really is one of the key things she brought up was human resources. That's the most important thing. We can talk about cool applications. We have cool applications other companies do that can change how we make the law for the better, but none of that can happen unless the people who are the professionals inside government who are managing change come along with it, can lead that kind of change. So often we encounter offices where the people who are in the office have had to spend the last 20 or 30 years maintaining old technology and have not had opportunities to explore and to see other ways to do things in an office. And that can be sometimes non-technological, just about how this goes from here to there to there. Sometimes those traditions, those paths are so well worn, they're very difficult to change. And so I think one of the first things to think about and that we have to always keep in mind is how we manage change with people, how we help them move forward with education and understanding what can become possible and where things can go to bring new technologies into a legislature that will benefit all of us. I think as I said before, the participation by parliaments and staff in organizations that can help share ideas, that can be a start to it. But it can be a very difficult and sometimes vexing problem. And you'll see it even when things are going right, where funding has come forward, a priority plan has been made, and you can begin to start a project to bring change along. But even as that project progresses, sometimes you can run into issues in which people are not ready for it, and they haven't been brought forward, as in any large institution when you're trying to bring change. And so I think that's something that part can't be forgotten and has to be a key priority of any effort to transform and move digitization forward.
Thank you so much, Mark, for your comments. Allow me to invite Vernon to share his comments on what you just said.
Thanks, Louis. I agree with Mark. I think change with people is a key aspect of organizational transformation. But before I even continue with that conversation, let me just say that the traditions within Parliament is important. And it's important because of the rich culture that it embraces. It's the stability that voters and citizens are accustomed to. These are the processes and the protocols of history, and I think that aspect of Parliament is really key, because how we make decisions, how we are emulating those decision-making processes in our parliaments is as important as those decisions themselves, because that is the historical part of how our parliaments operate. And I think that is important and key. And so I can understand why people within a parliamentary context would be holding on to how we have been doing it as part of tradition. And I don't think that technological enhancement is in contradiction with tradition. And I don't think that that this has to be a paradox or a conflict in itself. What I do think relates to what Ben said a little earlier around the issues of power and how we have become accustomed to and what benefit technology has for my political power and or the expanse of what the optics might be for a parliament who is enhancing and who's advancing. It is easier said than done. I think it's possible for us to embrace the traditional aspects of Parliament while still bringing in technology to highlight, to emulate, to expand on what Parliament can do, especially in the area of how to engage with people of the public. And how to involve people broadly within the democratic processes. I think one consideration for me is that, and I think colleagues around the screen here will probably agree that democracy, parliaments, and the relevance of parliaments have over the past couple of years become sharp into contrast, because people are beginning to question what the relevance of these parliaments are, what its purpose is, and what the future of parliaments are. And as we're getting newer and younger MPPs and we're looking at different kinds of generations within our organization, I think the profile of MPPs, of parliamentarians, of how we work and what we do is something that we are going to have to look at, not only to address the overall relevance of Parliament, but to look at how Parliament can engage with people far more effectively. While I'm saying all of this, colleagues, I do think that there isn't a one-size-fits-all. I have an 83-year-old mother that will never be going onto YouTube to watch a parliamentary program. She wants to be engaged face-to-face. And so the needs of parliamentarians and the needs of our communities are also different. And I think those are the kinds of things that we need to be bearing in mind, because I've got a 25-year-old son who's going to probably want to hear on TikTok what Parliament is doing. And I think these are the kinds of things that we need to be looking at when we are targeting parliamentarians themselves, employees within Parliament, and the community at large. That is what I wanted to just mention.
Thank you so much, Vernon, for your considerations. Benjamin, would you like to share your final thoughts on this question as well?
Yes, and thank you very much. And I think I agree with both Mark and Vernon on all that has been said. I mean, just to add that when it comes to the political context, for instance, I mean, in some parliament, and especially in our context, Africa, you know, where we revere authority, where we revere people in political, people who have power and all of that. And so sometimes some of these cultural underpinnings can even affect how we accept to use solutions or technology. And then again, you know, Parliament, as has already been said, it's an estate of power play, right? With the political parties having interest, the MPs themselves having interest and all of that. And even government at large, the executive, having its own agenda, right? And sometimes all of these political interests may affect even the agenda of Parliament, whether it's going to accept a particular solution or whether it has that funding, which takes me again into the issue of resource capacity, the issue of ability to afford, or the issue of having funds, right? So I usually say that you are lucky if you have a benevolent government that is willing, as a parliament, that is willing to, you know, buy into your idea, buy into your modernization strategy that is going to enhance transparency, is going to ensure accountability. You are lucky when you get a government that supports you. Other than that, then you may have to look for a benevolent partner, which of course our donors and our partners come in to support. Apart, if that is not the case, then it becomes difficult for parliaments, especially in Africa, to adopt some of these very fantastic ideas and unique solutions that would enhance and build our parliament up. And for me, I think these are things we need to consider.
Thank you so much, Ben, for your final considerations. We are reaching our final question of today's debate, and I'd like to start with you, Ben. And basically, civil society organizations that you represent and the specialized private sector represented here today by Mark are powerful allies in assisting parliaments, devolved legislatures, subnational legislatures, and highlighting possible opportunities for improvement in the parliamentary services and their interface with citizens. We are privileged actually to have such organizations in the legislative community to provide technical and political insights on how these topics in the institutions, such as our colleagues in the Parliament Network with the Transparency Index. Ben, what are your considerations about the opportunities for greater cooperation between parliaments and subnational legislatures and devolved legislatures with civil society organizations that are specialized in parliament as well as the specialized private sector?
Thank you very much, Louis. And I always say that whilst we are modernizing, whilst the world is changing, the needs of the citizens, the public, is also changing. And these needs are very enormous. And for parliaments to just, consider themselves as being able to handle some of these needs by themselves can become very challenging. And so there is always the need for parliaments to cooperate with civil society organizations and with the private sector to address some of these needs. And in doing so, what it means is that Parliament is able to enhance its policy development. Parliament is able to enrich its decision-making on government programs and policies because civil society has the experience, civil society has on all the issues that environment and all of that. Civil society has the expertise. I know a lot of society organizations also work on the ground with citizens.
Ben, allow me to interrupt you for a moment. We lost a little bit of what you just said in the last 30 seconds for poor connection. If you can repeat, I think you'd be good for the colleagues to understand.
Okay, sorry for that. So I'm saying that it's very important for Parliament to work closely with civil society because it's with these civil society that lies the experience and expertise that Parliament needs to enhance its work. Most of these civil society organizations work on the ground with citizens, and so they are able to even understand some of the very critical needs that Parliament or even representatives may not have an idea of. And so civil society are able to bring these needs of the citizens on board when they cooperate with Parliament. Again, when it comes to oversight and accountability, working closely with CSOs and even the private sector helps to enhance holding government accountable for its policies and its programs and all of that. Because again, for instance, Parliamentary Network Africa, we would monitor the government programs and policies and even track the bills in Parliament, right? What it means is that we are able to provide or monitor how government is implementing its programs after it has been passed in Parliament, whether it's committee or whether it's in plenary and all of that, so that we can track even its implementation after Parliament has adopted or have passed some of these laws and policies. And then again, I believe that when it comes to the private sector, of course, private sector has a lot of these tools, technology, and all of that. And so working closely with the private sector brings these technologies or tools closer to Parliament for them to use them, for them to learn or even gain from the expertise when it comes to training staff of Parliament, when it comes to training members of parliament on how to use some of these tools. And then finally, I think it also provides research or say evidence at the doorsteps of parliaments, whether it's committee work, whether it's MPs work and all of that, cooperating with CSOs who have the capacity and may have conducted a lot of surveys already on the needs of citizens, on the problems of the society. Parliaments do not have to re-engineer or do not have to re-undertake some of these surveys or research. They are already there. You just have to collaborate with CSOs to bring or to share these outcomes or findings with you, and you are good to go with developing your policies, your laws, and your programs around it. So I think cooperation between the private sector, cooperation between CSOs and parliament, we can't really overemphasize that, and it's very, very important, especially in Africa, to enhance our parliamentary democracy.
Thank you so much, Ben, for your considerations. Mark, would you like to share your thoughts on what Ben just said?
Sure, that's really interesting, Ben, what you shared in the governments you're working with. And I think what I think about is just how essential civil society organizations are to making digitization, modernization go not just the right way, but emphasize and kind of stay on track with the main purpose of it, which is to keep democracy sustainable and to keep these governments stable, to keep them open, to keep them, part of a larger community. I think particularly in a time like today, where we're seeing democracies under threat and challenged on lots of different sides, and particularly in my country and Luís in yours, where we've seen some very difficult moments and very horrific moments in our capitals. In Washington with the U.S. Congress, one of the best examples of civil society organizations being involved with technology change has been with a group called the Congressional Data Task Force. Obviously in Washington, there's many civil society organizations leaning in, being a part of all kinds of activities of government, from oversight to all kinds of things. But in this, there is one community that is very closely focused on technology change in Congress. And this is a group that involves the Senate, the House, the Government Publishing Office, the Library of Congress, the National Archives, Federal Register. They come together on a quarterly basis to talk about and have public meetings with civil society groups that care about this and that are very involved. So open data groups, transparency groups, digitization groups that are in Washington. And it's a great dialogue that tends to happen on a regular basis, where they share some of the proposed changes, talk about some of the things moving forward, and the civil society groups can have a lot of input and will make presentations and share ideas back and forth. And what we see is that it has kept a lot of the technology movements going in a very stable path, and one that tends to be very progressive, moving forward regularly. It creates a very large constituency and can help kind of bring an extra oomph of power to the change that needs to happen. And so and the progress then that has happened in the last 10 years of this group or so being around has been sensational in a lot of ways. So I think they can have a very big impact, and I think it's something that is not just about making sure this next application goes right, but it's really about the long term and the sustainability of the democratic institutions that they can help ensure.
Thank you so much, Mark. Vernon, would you like to share your thoughts on what the colleagues just shared?
I completely agree with both Mark and Ben. I think that the relationship that parliaments have with civil society is a key and important relationship, not only from a digital transformation perspective, but as Ben has also pointed out, as far as our core business within a parliament is concerned. So the relationship between civil society, how we can use, let's say, data oversight information as part of the core business, how we can use technology for better parliamentary decision making, for instance, how we can use experts in civil society to be able to assist us with making better pronouncements over particular laws and how those laws are being applied. So I do agree that Parliament is sort of the conduit for closer relationships with various sectors of our society. And I think those who are working within sectors concerned with digitization, digital transformation, I think those sectors are also important in order to showcase various aspects pertaining to innovation, looking to how we can leverage off that to enrich the work of Parliament even further. So completely agree with the colleagues. I do think that stakeholder engagement, whether these stakeholders are oversight bodies, whether it's Auditor General, or whether it is broader bodies within the organization, not-profit organizations or NGOs, who are actually adding value to the debate in Parliament and bringing particular perspectives around digital transformation and also transformation equality broadly within society. So I do think it's a natural relationship. And I also want to say that this is something, it's not new to parliaments to have engaging relationships with the private sector and with a range of organizations. This is how we work in Parliament. So, so that is really key in also mapping what our future journey would look like if parliaments would enhance and innovate.
Thank you so much, Vernon, for your considerations. Sadly, we are reaching out the end of our debate. We are a little bit behind schedule, but I wanted to yield the floor to each one of you for any final comments you might have on today's debate. We began alphabetically. I'll do the same, but from the opposite side. So starting with you, Vernon, would you like to share your final thoughts on today's debate?
I think this has been extremely, thanks again, Luís. I think today's debate has been extremely insightful. I would like to maintain kind of contact with a number of people in the sector. I think it is through these kinds of conversations that we actually also able to shift the goalposts and shape each other and learn from each other. And I think this kind of platform and these kinds of engagements help us all to be able to take a little bit away, take some learnings away, and share a little bit of what we've experienced on our journey as well. So thank you so much for involving me in this.
Thank you so much, Vernon. Mark, would you like to share your final thoughts on today's debate?
Sure. Just quickly, I thank you very much for putting this together, and it's been great to have these conversations with the two of you, and I look forward to keeping in touch. And I think that's one of the things that always comes out of these discussions. You know, while we will go deep on certain aspects of legislative technology and modernization and the challenges from here to there, I think one of the things that is always that leaves me so encouraged coming out of these is that none of us are alone here. We all have great passion for making this go right, for keeping government stable, for keeping government sustainable, for keeping government open and transparent, and helping to keep citizens engaged in a healthy way with their governments. And so it's great to have this community continue and to have all of us talking to each other and coming up with the great ideas to make things work even better. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mark. Ben, would you like to share your final thoughts?
Yes, Louis, and thanks very much for this opportunity again. And it's been wonderful to share this platform with Vernon and Mark. And for me, when I marry the discussions we are having here and even our exercise, the Open Parliament Index that we conducted or we assess parliaments in Africa, and having to identify some of the areas that parliaments are lacking when it comes to technology use or when it comes to modernization, it gives me the impression or hope that yes, not all parliaments may be at par or may be at the same adaptation level, but then some of these discussions gives us the hope to be able to, you know, gradually call for change or gradually call for improvement. And once again, thank you, and it's been always awesome to work together on this.
Thank you so much, Ben.